I'm Ron Strahan with the LSU AgCenter. We've had a lot of rainfall this year, especially in South Louisiana. Some areas have as much as 90 inches of rain, and we're just in mid-July. So what we're seeing a lot of in our landscapes is, especially in South Louisiana, but also some to a certain degree in North Louisiana, torpedo grass. Torpedo grass is a very difficult weed to manage. It produces a lot of biomass. It's loving all these wet conditions that we're having right now. It does produce seeds. Seeds on this plant are not considered to be viable. It reproduces by creeping into areas, but it has to be introduced into an area. And it's usually coming in with soil. We have so much in South Louisiana now, pretty much everything has it now. But usually if it's brought into a property, it's brought in by the soil. And so be careful where you get that soil from. You don't want to introduce the torpedo grass. Torpedo grass reproduces by stem fragments and by rhizomes and by creeping into areas. So it's in the landscape bed here. What do you do about torpedo grass? Well, we do have grass killers, graminicides that you can spray over the top of landscape plants. Active ingredients like cethoxidem and fluazafop, clethodim. These are all grass killers that typically work well on multitude of grasses, even Bermuda grass and crabgrass in the landscape bed. Unfortunately, they're not that effective on torpedo grass. Fluazafop is probably the most effective of those three that I mentioned there. But even fluazafop is not super effective on torpedo grass. What we have found is high rates of glyphosate have been the best bet. And whether you can spray high rates at like a 10% solution or wipe it. And they have these weed wipers on the market, and they allow you to be able to wipe weeds in the landscape bed without getting it on your landscape plants. And this has been pretty effective. You'd wipe it throughout the summer. We've actually had even better results as we get into fall, but of course, don't wait till the fall to control it. But that's torpedo grass, a weed that is thriving right now because of all the rainfall that we've had throughout the state. Another plant that we're seeing a lot of right now is chamber bitter. Chamber bitter is an annual broadleaf. In the last 20 to 25 years, it's become a huge problem in landscapes. It's a huge problem in the nursery industry, and it's a huge problem in landscapes too. So it is a broadleaf. It's in the same family as spurge. And what's kind of unique about this plant is it produces these seed capsules, and the seed capsules contain at least 6 seed per capsule. So it produces lots of seeds. Now it does hand pull pretty well in the landscape, and I always tell people that hand pulling weeds is very therapeutic. You're going to get a lot of therapy with something like chamber bitter because it does germinate. The seeds are extremely viable, so it does germinate a lot through the growing season. We start seeing it in April, start to germinate when soil temperatures get warm. Now, one thing is it does require light for germination, so a good thick mulch will help you. If you can get that mulch out at least by March, that will help you to a certain extent to cut down on some of the germination. As far as pre-emergence herbicides, we have really been disappointed with what we've seen in the past few years. Products that contain isoxaben have been fairly effective though, although erratic. Isoxaben would be like Gallery. Snapshot would be another example of a product that contains isoxaben. Products that contain oxyfluorophane, that would be like Rout or OH2. They've also had some activity pre-emergence on chamber bitter. But when it comes to chamber bitter, there's going to be a lot of hand removal of this plant. Don't allow seed production because of all the seeds that are produced by this plant. We rely to a certain extent on pre-emergence herbicide, but a good thick mulch also helps in controlling and combating this plant. With all the rainfall that we've had, we've seen a lot of sedges in landscape beds. Now, it's not unusual to see sedges in a landscape bed. Something like this purple nut sedge, very common in landscape beds. This is the #1 weed problem in the world. Very common to see purple nut sedge in landscape beds. You see yellow nut sedge in beds that are irrigated, and this year it's really thriving in landscape beds. with all the rainfall. Yellow nut sedge, like purple nut sedge, produces tubers, and purple nut sedge will produce those tubers in chains. Yellow nut sedge, more of a terminal tuber, but they are very invasive in landscape beds. As far as controlling purple or yellow nut sedge, there are pre-emergence herbicides that will have activity on it. Metolachlor has activity on it. Freehand is a pre-emerge herbicide that has some activity on it. Dimethenamide has activity on it. So we have some pre-emergence options that work pretty well for yellow nut sedge, not so much for purple. As far as post-emerge control, purple nut sedge and yellow nut sedge, and all these sedges that we have right here are really sensitive to sulfosulfuron, especially green kalinga. Another one that we see a lot of in wet areas, green kalinga, doesn't produce tubers. It reproduces by seeds and by rhizomes and by creeping into areas. And these are all perennial sedges. We also have a lot of annual sedges like this rice flat sedge right here. Annual sedges also, metolachlor has some activity pre-emergence on them. They're all pretty sensitive to halosulfuron or sulfosulfuron. Sulfosulfuron seems to be a little bit better on green kalinga than halosulfuron. Another sedge that we're seeing a lot of, and it's kind of unusual to see it, is this tall flat sedge. Now this is a perennial sedge that really thrives well in wet conditions, and you can see the root system on this plant right here. This is tall flat sedge and a very robust sedge. Maybe in landscapes that are neglected, you'll see a lot of this sedge right here. Not really a lot of pre-emergence options for these sedges right here. When it comes to all these sedges, most of them are going to be pretty sensitive to sulfosulfuron. Purple and yellow nut sedge will be sensitive to halosulfuron. And so we just kind of have to manage them as best we can in a landscape bed setting. Some of these will hand pull okay with something like a green kalinga. If you hand pull it, try to get as much of it as you can. And remember, it is more of a rhizomatous sedge, and you can usually hand pull and get a big chunk out and get most of that one right there. You want to get it because it does produce a lot of seeds. Another thing that we're seeing in landscape beds is Virginia buttonweed, of all things. And often we'll spread Virginia buttonweed just by mowing. It reproduces by seeds, of course. It's perennial, but it also reproduces by stem fragments. And so when you're mowing the yard, you'll blow the Virginia buttonweed fragments into the flower bed. It'll take root, and you've got a problem in the flower bed with Virginia buttonweed. This one's starting to flower out now. It's getting very mature. You can hand remove it, but likely you're going to leave the taproot. A good way to get rid of it is either where you can spray it with glyphosate, but this is a very sensitive area. We have these rose bushes right here. So on a situation like this, I would likely take a weed wiper with glyphosate and go in and just kind of wipe it as best you can. Wipe it. And glyphosate, very effective on it, will translocate from the leaves down into the root system and kill the Virginia buttonweed at this location in the landscape bed without hurting this rose bush.